Hello there, everyone. How you doing today? I hope you're all well. Today we're going into r/entitled people, where people are very well and very much entitled, and we go over the stories where they get their comeuppance. If you enjoy, remember to like and subscribe, and leave comments with your thoughts down below. Now, without further ado, let's get started. Entitled client thinks that everything can be solved by talking to the supervisor. For a little more context, I work as a receptionist at a medical clinic, and it is not my job of choice. Even though I don't love my job, I take it seriously, as other people's health is no joke. In addition to having the job policy of doing the best job possible at the moment, I have seen many clients who are rude or disrespectful, including an elderly lady trying to beat my coworker using a cane, which became the unit's internal joke for the month. Another day, a client arrives with 3 pages of exams to take. Big, but not the biggest I've ever seen, and as always, I added each exam to the system. Keep in mind that it is not the only step in the work. It is still necessary in some medical plans to take additional requests and add each individual code back to the health insurance system. As the client was on the phone, the first part was very quiet, but when she finished the call, she started complaining and insisting on being in a very loud tone for the whole place to hear, talking about how long I was taking and how much time she needed to be there. As professionally as possible, I said what I was doing and what was taking so long. I was attaching the order to a fixed agreement and waiting for the return. The client asked to speak to my supervisor, who was already coming to see what had happened. My supervisor knows this type of client very well and knows it's not possible to do all the procedures by magic. With all the professional words, he explained to the client. The client did not accept what my supervisor said and demanded that my supervisor substitute me for another coworker. My supervisor, being responsible for the area, had to resolve the situation. Now here comes the part the client does not know. All the forms have to be opened at the login of who is making the request. And as I was no longer responsible, with a big smile, I erased everything I had spent almost 2 hours doing, and I had to cancel the request for medical insurance. Good luck having to wait another 2 hours for a complicated medical record to be done again, in addition to the time after the exams are approved in health insurance. Parents told my brother that he could take my house and I could just live in the camper in the backyard because I'm single and he has a wife and kids. I'm a single man in my early 30s. I've got a brother who's 29 and he's already got 4 kids now. He had his first at 22 and the second followed a year later. Then the third 2 years after that. And the fourth is the most recently born a couple months ago. His wife, my sister-in-law, and I do not get along as she always likes to try and get a rise out of me by acting superior. And then this turns into a self-victimizing drama queen if I retaliated against her in any way. She can cry in an instant and put on an extremely convincing show to get sympathy from just about anyone. My parents and brother absolutely adore her, even though they know exactly how she really is and they just don't care. She is very good looking, I'll give her that. But she's so awful I could never be attracted to her. She also refuses to get any sort of job, even though she has a college degree, and my mother willingly helps with the kids all day. So their finances are entirely dependent on my brother. And this also means they can't afford to live anywhere but my parents' house. And privacy is a bit of an issue with them. Under one roof in a 3-bedroom house that was built in the 60s. Growing up, my younger brother was the obvious favorite. We're all 3 years apart in age, but he developed a superiority complex because I was badly punished if I retaliated against his antics in any way back then. It was obvious my parents cared a lot more for him because he got the lion's share of everything, unless people called them out on it, which did happen a fair bit by other members of the family, which is why my parents packed all of us up and moved out about 150 miles away from them. So generally, only one would see us on holidays, since it was a 3 hour drive. My brother got physically abusive towards me on a number of occasions, flirted relentlessly with my first girlfriend to the point she broke up with me, and laughed at any misfortune that I experienced. And my parents just told me to suck it up whenever I was upset about it. I only got equal treatment when my parents wanted to keep up appearances. I admit it was rather funny to see the looks on their faces whenever they had to treat me equally to my brother on birthdays and Christmas, because other people were present. We had relatives that were very nosy and loved gossiping drama, so my parents did their best to hide what was really going on, and threatened to take all my stuff away if I didn't keep my mouth shut. If anything, it just made my parents celebrate more when I turned 18 and moved out, because it meant they no longer had to provide for me. I wasn't even done with high school yet when I moved out, but couch surfing was far better than living with them. I was low contact ever since leaving home. They didn't even show up for my high school graduation, but I really didn't care. From that point on, I would usually only see my parents and brother on holidays like the rest of my family. The start of the 2020 pandemic was not kind to me. I lost my job and couldn't renew the lease on my condo because my roommate also lost his job and neither of us could afford the place on unemployment money. It was rented a 2-bedroom condo that I really loved. As the lease was ending, my roommate left early to move back in with his relatives, and I had to sell nearly all of my stuff because I was soon going to be homeless if I didn't downsize to an extreme. I really shouldn't have rented a place that was so expensive, but I liked living the high life. Until that, life was not so kind to me, and I realized I should have been living somewhere far cheaper so I could have saved more money to fall back on. But I had a plan. I own a truck simply for the fact I've always loved trucks. So I found a $1,000 camper in good shape and put it on my truck just so I could live out of it for a while. It was supposed to be temporary, but I ended up living out of it far longer than I ever thought. I originally was hoping to be able to live out of the camper of my parents' house, where my brother and his family still reside as well. But when I asked my parents, they told me they had a full house and didn't want me there. Plus, we hadn't exactly gotten along in the past decade. They said they'd only agree to let me park my camper there if I paid them, basically what it would cost to rent an apartment in my area, and that was too much to justify to park my camper. I was jobless and trying to save as much of my unemployment money as I could until I could find a new job. I may as well be living in an apartment with that rent price they were asking. My parents called my camper an eyesore and told me to take a hike since we couldn't come to an agreement. Sister-in-law thought it was absolutely hilarious I had to live in a camper. My brother joined her in pointing at and mocking me, calling me a homeless bum. I parked my truck and camper in a store parking lot to sleep on the first night that I had nowhere else to go. I was scared out of my mind that somebody might try to break in. Suffice to say, I didn't sleep well that night. There was nowhere else I could go, as any other relatives that owned houses were fairly far away, and all my friends were all apartment people, and I was pretty attached to my area as well, so I didn't want to just leave. I'd also had my mail forwarded to a friend's apartment. It was the only way I could still get my mail anymore. Finding a stable place to park was pretty difficult. I went looking around to try and find a job similar to my old one. It took months of living the nomadic camper life. In that time, I had to deal with a lot. Everything from beggars to drug addicts to people demanding I leave because my camper was an eyesore. At one point, someone who told me to move claimed to be with an HOA. I wasn't even parked on a street with houses. And when I questioned what HOA, they got extremely belligerent and threatened me. I moved my camper anyway just to avoid the trouble. In order to have a steady supply of electricity, I learned to use a long extension cord to plug in anywhere I could to recharge my camper batteries. This meant sneaking around and plugging it into an outside outlet of a random building while parked on a street. I know that's a crummy thing to do, but I had to keep my batteries charged, so my refrigerator would stay cold. I had a small solar power bank for recharging my phone, but I didn't have anything like a generator, and generators are noisy and require fuel anyway. So I did what I had to do. After months of living like that, I finally managed to get a new job. I had to move to the neighboring city to find a job that didn't involve retail. I worked retail while I was in college and promised myself never again, though I was nearly ready to break that promise. I was still getting unemployment money, but I had no stable place to live while receiving it, and I didn't want to still be jobless when it ran out. Plus, I was bored out of my mind. I had little else to do but read, watch movies on a small portable DVD player, use my phone and laptop, and keep note of where I could park, and what local public bathrooms I could use. I kind of envy that the Japanese have public bathhouses. We could really use stuff like that up here. When I finally landed a new job, I practically lived in the back lot of the building by the warehouse. In the old employee parking spaces literally no one else seemed to bother using. Because they were so far in the back, the area was borderline forgotten. My boss/company owner actually liked this arrangement because I was willingly available to take any shift I could get, so long as I had enough sleep. He even let me take my camper off my truck and set it up in one of the spaces, so I could drive around without it. Not exactly sure if this was legal, but nobody bothered us about it. The entire time I lived back there, I didn't have to deal with many trespassers. There were a few, but the security guards escorted them out. I was pretty much on call all the time when they needed me, and was working virtually every day of the week. My boss let me plug my camper into the building for power and water, and I paid a small amount of rent by working for free on Sundays when no one else was in the office, but the janitor and security guard. Beyond that, I usually had to shower at a friend's apartment or at a local gym, as the camper didn't have a shower in it, and only a portable toilet, and I didn't want to fill it because emptying it is, well, a nasty chore. So I used other bathrooms as often as I could. I had a key to the warehouse, and could go to use it in the bathroom there at any hour. I was even on first-name basis with the night security guard. He's since become one of my closest friends. The camper was easy to heat in the winter, with a small electric heater. Summers were not fun, though, since the camper didn't have air conditioning, so I had to get a used portable air conditioner just to make it bearable. I made a lot of overtime pay and hands-on learn some new skills from other employees. Eventually, midway into this year, I landed a better position in the company as a supervisor and started making a better salary than my old job. And that's when I decided I wanted a house. The scare I'd gotten from losing my condo made me realize I needed something far more stable for the long term. I looked around for something close to my work, and just 2 miles away found a 3-bedroom manufactured home on a small property. I managed to get it for $10,000 less than the asking price somehow. I used nearly my entire savings for a down payment, and got approved for a home loan. I finally didn't have to live in a camper anymore. There was enough space for me to back my truck in behind the house, to take the camper off to set it in the backyard. So I put it there as its own little building, just in case I wanted to use it again. When I was fully settled into the house, I was dumb enough to brag about it on the Book of Faces. My family saw the post, and that's when this stuff really starts. After a few weeks, my parents and brother, along with his family, came to visit completely unannounced to have a tour of my home. I didn't even give them my address, so how they found out where I live, I still don't know. None of my friends have fessed up, and no prior family members visited me before that, so I wonder if they stalked me at work and followed me home or something. It really wouldn't surprise me. Once I opened the door, they practically shoved their way in like rambunctious tourists, then just started making themselves at home. They all kept poking around, and sister-in-law had this creepy smirk that she was repeatedly flashing me, and it was only later I figured out why. And it made me madder than a bull on steroids that just got stung by a hornet. My parents were constantly talking about how I'd got so much extra space now, and it's too much for someone like me who has no wife or kids. Sure, not now, but maybe someday. And my brother kept remarking about how there was more space than our parents' house, and my house was closer to his job too. Red flags all round, I know. Eventually my brother asked me to speak privately. Everyone else suddenly left the room and piled out to the front porch. And that's what finally made me realize they planned something. My brother, let's call him Dan for the sake of simplicity, said the house was too much for me alone and I should let him move in with his family because his wife is pregnant with kid number 4, and that my house is much closer to his job. He pointed out that I already had the camper, so I could just live in that outside, while they live in the main house. And I'd like to point out that Dan never once spoke of offering rent. Mind you, he's got a good job, so he also started talking about how there would be changes, and even curfews, and that I couldn't just walk in any time without prior notice. If it weren't my brother, I'd think the person I was talking to had lost their mind. But Dan lost his marbles long ago thanks to our parents treating him like he was the center of the world. I tried to speak, but he kept talking over me as if I had no say in the matter. There was no way in hell I'd rent my house out, or parts of my house to him. Other people, maybe, just so I can pay the mortgage off easier, but certainly not him or his nasty wife. I've heard this exact kind of situation happen in videos online many times, and never once did I think I'd actually live it, because I thought it was so ludicrous. But my parents, brother, and sister-in-law do fit the bill for a bunch of narcissists, entitled crazies. So I picked up my phone and set it to recording, and then just held on to it. Dan didn't seem to care or notice that I'd done this, and then just sat there with his arms waving around while talking about all the reasons he needed my house. Then went from saying that to acting like it was a done deal, trying to reach out his hand to shake mine. And that's when I finally showed my backbone and said, "Hell no." And I said it loud enough that Dan stumbled backwards for a second. I'd rarely ever raised my voice to him on that level, because I was punished by our parents whenever I did it. But this was my house, not theirs. My spine can be as shiny as I want it to be. And acting like I'll let him move in just because I want it won't happen. I bought my house for me, and it's not my fault he keeps having more kids and has to keep living with our parents because he can't afford to move out. Dan got physically close to me as he could without actually touching me, and said that I didn't deserve the house and he needed a better place for his family to live. I laughed back in his face and said that was total BS, because I worked hard to be able to buy my house. Of course I deserved it. Dan started yelling that I have no wife or kids and I shouldn't need all this space, so I may as well just give it to him. I said I'm not giving him anything, and he never even offered to pay me rent. If I let him move in, I'd still be covering the entire mortgage on my own house, without even being able to live in my own house. Then Dan said that he shouldn't have to pay rent because his family comes first, and our parents said I was going to do this, and that I will. I yelled, as if their word is law or something, and told Dan that they did not have the right or power to give my house to him. Then write one cue to my parents and sister-in-law barging in through the front door and surrounding me to try and force me to agree. There was a lot of fighting, but to sum it up from this point, I heard the line, "Just do it for Dan," way more times than I could remember. In the fight, I told them all that they don't have a say in my life or my house, and to get out before I called the cops. Sister-in-law screamed the loudest she ever had at me about how she was pregnant again, and I can't do this to her. I said I did nothing to her. She just assumed she could take and take from me like I'll just allow it. I had no obligation to her or her family. Then I called her a stuck-up little female dog who never had any respect for me. So I don't care what she thinks or how many kids she has. I have no sympathy for her. She won't be living in my house. Well, that made her angry enough to attack me. She got in one good hit on my face and tried to do more, but my brother held her back, kicking and screaming. She kept demanding he let her go so she could scratch my eyes out. The phone I was holding recorded pretty much everything, so I held it up and said I was going to call police if they didn't leave right away. My parents told Dan they were leaving. Then my mother said that I had a week to come to my senses. I told her I won't be and to not come back. I then told sister-in-law that my phone recorded everything. If she tries anything, I'll press charges for assault. She screamed at me and then stormed out loudly, crying with her face still in her hands. My mother was the last one out the door and said that I better do this for Dan and sister-in-law. I responded by telling her I won't be. And guess what, people? There's a part 2. On to part 2. As I stated in the first half of my post, many will find this unbelievable and long. Yes, I'm aware there are similar sounding posts online already. I've seen a number of them now. But it's not like those posters have a monopoly on this sort of stuff happening to them. If anything, I'm surprised this site hasn't been a better weaponized against this sort of thing, since entitled people should be more afraid about getting outed here. But anyway, I do not blame you for anyone who calls this BS. I would too. After I kicked my parents, brother, and sister-in-law out for trying to force me to hand over my new house to my brother, I immediately went to social media and told the story to the whole family. It spread pretty fast, but you won't find it now because it got deleted some time ago, and I put my profile on private. I posted about it because I knew the first thing my family would do when they got home is try and twist the event to make me the villain, and I was exactly right. But I had about an hour to get started before them, and I had video evidence to back up my story about what they'd done. Being preemptive worked because I got a fair number of family members on my side right away. My parents, brother, and sister-in-law must have been all set to write their own post, but it was too late, so they didn't even bother trying to lie much. My parents, Dan, and sister-in-law had a few flying monkeys supporting them, but not much else. Plenty of others knew how entitled they already were, so what happened was something they all quickly understood and accepted. There was one person in particular that called me. I don't know who they were, but they just ranted to me that I was a horrible brother, and I needed to make way for a real family man. I just ended the call and blocked the number, and this did not repeat. The week went by and my parents showed up with Dan on my front porch, like they said they would in their prior ultimatum. They rang my doorbell like crazy and pounded on the door until I finally answered. I opened it just a crack and they tried to shove their way in again, but I'd installed a couple of latch chains that prevented it, and even braced my body against the door for good measure. My father and brother demanded I let them in, but I said I was recording everything on camera and would call the police if they tried to force their way in again. Mother calmed them down and then in her most sickly sweet tone asked me if I was ready to let my brother move in. I told her and the rest of them to screw off and never come back. My mom put on the crocodile tears and asked me why I can't just do this for Dan. Because he's my beloved brother. I laughed and then bluntly said I don't love him as a brother because he treated me like crap for years. And they only encouraged him to do so. They are terrible parents and he is a terrible brother. I then told them to leave or I'd be calling police as soon as possible. They left surprisingly easy, apart from my mother's loud crying and the others giving me dirty looks. One could say making them leave was suspiciously easy. I thought the whole mess was over, but I guess I should have taken them more seriously, because they had other stupid plans. I came home later that week on Friday to find a moving truck and my brother's minivan parked in my driveway. It was Dan and his family there moving stuff in. He waved to me with a shit-eating grin when I saw him. I was furious and told him and the rest of his family to stop. But sister-in-law smugly said to me that, like it or not, they were moving in. And then, in the most fake way while tilting her head and puckering her lips, she said that it was okay because Mommy allowed it, and I should always listen to what Mommy tells me. I seethed with rage and just hearing those words, and looking at her smug face. So I locked myself in my truck to call the cops right away. And when they realized what I was doing, sister-in-law started pounding on my window and yelling at me to stop. And that why can't I just do this for her? Because she and Dan needed the house and she cried, "Why can't you do this for Dan?" I responded with, "Fuck Dan, it's my damn house, not his." She then threatened to key the side of my truck unless I stopped calling the police. All of which the 911 operator heard, thanks to the window being slightly open. I told sister-in-law if she damaged my truck, I'd sue her, and she was smart enough to retreat. When the police arrived, Dan and sister-in-law, along with the kids, had locked themselves in my house. I told the cops what had happened, as well as showing them my new driver's license that had my current address on it. Then when we went to my front door, I saw they changed the lock, and the old lock was laying on the porch with the center of it drilled out, and the drill they used was laying right next to it, with a complete Harbor Freight drill bit set. Could they have been any more stupid leaving evidence out like that? I pointed out the broken lock and drill, then gave the police a rundown of all the events that happened prior. Well, I guess Dan called our parents over at some point after I arrived home, because they showed up while I was talking to the cops. My parents immediately lied and said that I had agreed to rent my house to my brother and his family. I said that was an easily provable lie one way or another. So Dan and sister-in-law came out of the house with some papers in hand. They both looked super smug, like they somehow outsmarted me. They had actually drawn up and printed out a fake rental agreement, but my signature was not on it. There was one, but it looked nothing like my handwriting. I don't think any of them have actually seen my signature, so that was incredibly stupid on their part. I told my parents and Dan that was stupidly blatant fraud, and if the cops investigated, they'd easily figure that out. And I don't think going to jail and court would do them any good. It could even make Dan lose his job, which is his only means of providing for his family. I also said I would get a lawyer and sue for damages if anything of mine was lost, stolen, or broken, and I'd call CPS for good measure. Dan went white and looked really scared when I said all that, but my mother got between us and doubled down how I should just do this for Dan and live in the damn camper so they can have a family home to themselves. I yelled at her that if she thought it was such a good idea, she could do it for Dan herself and let Dan have her house to himself all instead. The cops separated my mother from me, and I said I wanted them all out right now or I'd press charges. I stated in a shout about how they drilled out my front lock to break in. The lease paper were obvious fakes, they badly forged my signature, and I have recorded video of sister-in-law attacking me. Those are felonies I could screw over their lives with if I wanted, and if they didn't leave, that's exactly what I'd do. The only reason I hadn't already was for the sake of Dan's kids, so they have one chance to get out. The moment my parents heard that, I think it finally clicked they could not force me to do it for Dan. My mother surrendered and said she'd put an end to this. Then she went over to sister-in-law and spoke with her quietly for a minute, while my father spoke to Dan. Sister-in-law instantly started crying loudly and ripping up the fake rental papers into tiny bits and tossing them like confetti, only to have an officer tell them to pick up the bits of papers or he'd cite them for littering. Both the cops at this point had the "I don't get paid enough for this" looks on their faces. Dan had to start telling his kids to load their stuff back in the moving truck. The kids were all crying and the eldest was sobbing that he won't get his own room now. Sister-in-law and Dan gathered all their kids up to try and make one last pathetic attempt to guilt me with the sad family routine. You know, where they all gathered together in a sort of group hug while all facing one direction. I swear, I think they'd practiced it beforehand. All of the kids had the same pleading look with the quivering mouths. Sister-in-law kept rubbing her pregnant belly and tilting her head to look like a sad puppy. And my brother just made the biggest, saddest face he possibly could and said, "Please don't do this. We need to be able to live here." But I didn't falter and told them to keep packing. All the kids and sister-in-law turned the crying up to 11, and Dad yelled at me, "Are you satisfied with yourself? You've denied us a home because you're too selfish to share and help out family." I ended up laughing like a maniac and retorting that what he was trying to do was taking, not sharing, and no amount of crying will make me let his family move in because he's no brother of mine anymore. He's just an entitled prick who thinks he can take whatever he wants from me, like when we were kids. Dan started F-bombing me until the cops told him to cool it or he'd be in cuffs regardless if I wanted to press charges. He sucked in his lips and looked like a mix of afraid and supremely pissed off. I asked the cops if they could stick around until my parents, brother, and sister-in-law had all left, and they said they have no intention of going anywhere until this had been resolved. In fact, the next few minutes, 2 cops became 4, as more drove in for whatever reason. That gave my parents some extra incentive to get moving. I made Dan give me the keys to the new lock he put on my front door. Though I got another lock the next day anyway, because I didn't know if they had copies of the keys or not. He was really reluctant to hand them over. Then, instead of handing them to me, he actually threw them down the street and into a storm drain while saying to get them myself. But one of the cops scolded him for that and made him go get them. He had to pull the grate off just to get to them. And he got pretty dirty in the process. When he got the keys back, he just grumbled and slammed them down into my hand. I then told them all to leave and never come back. My mother said I'd be disowned for this, as if that were some kind of threat to me, and I voiced to them, in an overly sarcastic tone, I said, "Oh no! That means I won't get to come to any holidays with you guys, where I always get treated like shit by you all anyways. Because Dan has always been your obvious favorite. You treated me so badly when I was growing up that if Dan ever needed an organ donor, I wouldn't give him anything. So, do you like how you always told me to do when I was mistreated by all of you? And suck it up." My parents were floored as I said all of that, and the quartet of cops were looking pretty judgmental at them as well. I tell you, if you want to put nasty parents like mine on the spot, confront them in front of cops, because they'll likely not try anything really stupid then. My mother just started crying and walking away. My father just stood there looking like he wanted to hit me, and Dan just held his kids in defeat, and sister-in-law was having a tantrum on my front lawn. Soon enough, they all formed a line handing out boxes and got their stuff out of my house. Nothing had been unpacked yet, so it was still taken out pretty quickly. But while doing it, my mother kept saying that it wasn't too late, and I could still do it for Dan several times. Each time trying to bargain more and more, trying to make me change my mind. She said that Dan could pay me rent if I let them stay, and when that didn't work, she said I could move back in with them to let Dan rent my house so I wouldn't have to share the building. I told her to shut up and keep packing boxes, because I don't want Dan or his family around, and I don't want his money, and I certainly don't want to live with him or my parents ever again after the way they treated me when I was a kid. Making a deal with my parents would be like making a deal with the devil to me. Sister-in-law ended up having another tantrum after hearing that, and threw a box down and sat on the ground to have a pity party, because she didn't want to go back to sharing a house with my parents. And she just sat looking angry, sad, until everyone else was finished. She didn't even want to get up when it was time to leave. They finally got everything out of the house and into the truck. So before they left, I laid into my parents one last time about all the shit they put me through growing up. And with 4 cops being right there, they couldn't do much other than stand there and take it for once. I called them out on so many things that happened, and even pointed out how they couldn't do something nice for me, like letting me stay over with my camper when I was homeless, and trying to get back up on my feet. How they let Stan and sister-in-law ridicule me and call me a bum. Well, who's the bum now? They wanted to kick me out of my own house so Dan could stay in it, free of charge. Yet when I needed a place to go, they wanted to gouge me for more than I could afford, just to park my camper when they knew I was out of the job. There were more extremely judgmental stares from the cops when I said all of that. So I put my parents on the spot one more time and asked them what I ever did other than being born to deserve being treated so badly. Because when I finally have a bit of success in life, they want to snatch it away from me for their favorite child, since they'd rather I give everything to Dan and have nothing for myself. I bought my house using the money that I earned. I owed them nothing, and I won't be asking anything from them ever again, because clearly I'll never be anything to them, more than a doormat or a cash cow. I got no answers from them, and they stood there looking like fish out of water. So I continued ranting, and asked them what in God's name made them think they were such good parents after all of that. My father was beet red, but more from embarrassment than anger this time. And my mother was crying that she was a horrible person, and I bluntly agreed. I said, I'll bet they'll go to hell for it too. They were shitty people and they all knew it. But if I called them out on this stuff in private instead of public, they just get mad at me and still act like I'm in the wrong. They just kept up the denial for so long that it became a part of who they are. My mother buried her face in her father's jacket to cry, and my father looked more defeated than I've ever seen him. Dan and his family avoided me entirely as they finished putting everything back in the moving truck. I made sure nothing of mine was stolen. Not that I had much of a chance to get much furniture yet. I was lucky to even have a couch at that time. They all got back in their vehicles. Sister-in-law just stood there, staring at me with malice until my brother finally got her to drive the minivan home. And as soon as they were all gone, I got back online again and spilled the beans on what happened. My parents were too embarrassed to even try and defend their actions this time. And while the family was somewhat split before this incident, it was now a landslide in my favor. Nearly all of the family have sided with me after this incident, and those who haven't aren't siding with anybody. No matter how much my parents previously tried, the "we did it for Dan" line, no one listened anymore. So any remaining familial support they had was gone. Many in the family who I expected wouldn't side with me did, and that includes the former flying monkeys, so I guess they finally had enough. Around that time, I offered to host half the family at Christmas Eve in my new house. My parents were not invited. I wasn't blocked on my brother and sister-in-law's profile, surprisingly, and I saw sister-in-law had her fourth baby in early November. They're still living with my parents, and I'm pretty sure they knew I was watching, because sister-in-law kept making passive-aggressive posts every couple of weeks or so about not having enough space while living with my parents. Probably to see if she could still guilt me. And I'm sure it's driving my mother and father up the wall because they aren't getting any peace and quiet in their old age with 3 rowdy, obnoxious kids, a mentally unstable sister-in-law, my golden child brother, and a newborn baby in the house at once. Perhaps they could move into a camper in their own backyard and let Dan take over the house completely. They might get some peace then. Yeah, they could do that for Dan. They were supposed to be more, but this post got way too long. And that's the end of today's video. Sorry this video got a bit long. I was using my new mic and new equipment to record a nice video. Remember to like, subscribe, and comment your thoughts down below. And remember to check out my links in the description below. I will see you all next time.